This is our Wednesday night Bible study, and because we can't be together in the fellowship hall like we normally are, I thought I would take the same message I was planning on doing and put it on video. And so this evening we're going to be in 2 Samuel chapter 6. I want to begin reading at verse 1 and we'll continue through verse 11. 2 Samuel 6, verse 1. David again gathered all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000. And David arose and went with all the people who were with him from Baal Judah to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord of hosts, who sits enthroned on the cherubim. And they carried the ark of God on a new cart and brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. And Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, were driving the new cart with the ark of God, and Ahio went before the ark. And David and all the house of Israel were celebrating before the Lord with songs and lyres and harps and tambourines and castanets and cymbals. And when they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah put out his hand to the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen stumbled. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and God struck him down there because of his error, and he died there beside the ark of God. And David was angry because the Lord had broken out against Uzzah, and that place is called Perez Uzzah to this day. And David was afraid of the Lord that day, and he said, "How can the ark of the Lord come to me?" So David was not willing to take the ark of the Lord into the city of David, but David took it aside to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. And the ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite 3 months, and the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all his household. Whenever you're talking to non-Christians about the Lord, sometimes they'll bring up difficult or controversial passages in the Bible and try to get you to explain it. But this is one of those stories that not only do non-Christians bring up, Christians have a hard time understanding it. And the reason is because God does something in this story which absolutely nobody is expecting. And so the people ask this question: why would God kill a man whose only fault is trying to protect the Ark of the Covenant from falling? And so I want us to work our way through this story, look at a little bit of history and background, and let's see if there's anything we can find that will help us to understand what happened here. Well, in this part of 2 Samuel, if you've been with us in our study so far on these Wednesday nights, this is the story of the time when David had finally become king over all of Israel. He had been king just in Judah up to this point, and now he's king over the entire nation. And he's just defeated 2 of his most powerful enemies. First of all, the Jebusites, who were living in a city called Jebus, which David overcame and turned it into his capital city, which eventually becomes known as Jerusalem. And then he had gone after the Philistines, who were living in the land, and run them out through the power of God moving in his army. And so now, with all of these victories in place, David felt it was important for him to go and get the Ark of the Covenant and bring it back to its rightful place of honor in the land of Israel. So this was a time of rejoicing. When you get to this part of 2 Samuel, you realize that David's kingdom had begun with great success. There had been 2 very powerful military victories over the enemies of Israel. And now the ark was about to be returned, and it was in the process of coming home. And everybody is rejoicing and expecting even more blessings from the Lord. In fact, you can see the rejoicing. We'll read verse 5 again. David and all the house of Israel were celebrating before the Lord with songs and lyres and harps and tambourines and castanets and cymbals. But then something happens in the story that nobody's expecting to see. They come to an uneven surface, apparently, and it causes the oxen who are pulling the cart to stumble. And that stumbling of the oxen causes the cart to get a little bit off balance, and because the ark is apparently beginning to slide, and it's in danger of falling off the cart and onto the ground, a man named Uzzah, he's the son of the man whose cart it is and the son of the man who had held the ark in his home, Uzzah reaches out his hand to steady the ark. But rather than blessing Uzzah for protecting this holy vessel, God kills him. Look at verse 7 again. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and God struck him down there because of his error, and he died there beside the ark of God. Now, there's a phrase there in the middle of that verse that I think we need to look at closely if we want to understand why God judged this man, Uzzah. Right in the middle of verse 7, it says, God struck him down there because of his error. Here's the problem we have. Translating this word, even for scholars who've spent their entire lives studying the Hebrew language, translating this word is difficult. It's the Hebrew word shal. We would transliterate it S-H-A-L. But the problem is this is the only place that we know of where this word appears in the Hebrew language. And so because we've got nothing to compare it to, this is where it shows up and nowhere else, scholars and translators are not 100% certain exactly what it means. There are different translations of the Bible that do things a little bit differently. Some translations say that he was struck down for his irreverent act. Others say that he was struck down for his mistake, which is very similar to the word error that appears here in the Bible translation I'm using. But even those translations are only guesses, and they're based on the context and the way the story flows, because again, we really don't know exactly what this word means. But there is one thing that a lot of scholars are convinced of in looking at similar languages that use similar words. They believe that the word shal in Hebrew involves doing something suddenly or in a hurry. And that makes sense. If you just imagine yourself in that situation, if you'd been there watching, you can see it unfolding in your mind's eye. You've got the procession moving along, and you've got all these people, very probably thousands of them around it. They're rejoicing, and then the oxen stumble, and the ark is in danger of sliding off the cart and falling onto the ground, and purely by instinct, suddenly, Uzzah reaches out to steady it. The problem was, he was not allowed to do that because God had made it clear, and I'll show this to you in a minute, the ark was not to be touched by human beings. It was a holy vessel. And for a sinful man to touch the ark was an act of disobedience to what God had clearly commanded. In fact, I'm going to give you some scriptures that show you what God had said about how to handle the ark. First of all, the ark was so holy that not only were people not allowed to touch it, they weren't even supposed to see it. Look at Exodus chapter 26, verse 33. It says, "You shall hang the veil from the clasps," talking about the setting up of the tabernacle in the wilderness, "and bring the ark of the testimony." That's this ark we're talking about. "Bring the ark of the testimony in there within the veil, and the veil shall separate for you the holy place from the most holy." In other words, it was in the place where nobody could see. People weren't supposed to look at it. And then later on, in Joshua chapter 3, there's a story of the ark being carried by the priests of Israel, and the people of Israel were told to stay about 1,000 yards away from it. It's in Joshua chapter 3, in the middle of verse 3, it says, "As soon as you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God being carried by the Levitical priests, then you shall set out from your place and follow it." Now watch verse 4. "Yet there shall be a distance between you and it, about 2,000 cubits in length. Do not come near it." And 2,000 cubits was, again, roughly 1,000 yards. So we're talking 10 football fields. So it's a holy instrument. It's a holy vessel. And that's why the writer here in this story in 2 Samuel chapter 6, he was very careful in the wording he used even to describe the ark. He didn't simply refer to it by its name, the Ark of the Covenant or the Ark of the Testimony. Instead, he used very specific words that emphasized what the ark represented. Back in 2 Samuel 6, let's reread that part of verse 2. It talks about the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord of hosts, who sits enthroned on the cherubim. The point is, the ark was holy. The ark was set aside from other things because it represented the presence of God. Of course, Uzzah, when he reached out to steady the ark and to stop it from falling, he wasn't thinking about this. He was simply trying to do what was in his mind the right thing, but his well-meaning action cost him his life. Look again at verse 7. And God struck him down there because of his error. Now, obviously, this tragedy could have been avoided entirely if David had simply done what God had originally commanded back in the law. First of all, as we've already read, the ark was never meant to be seen by human eyes. Let me read you another passage, this time in Numbers chapter 4, which talks about this. Numbers chapter 4, verses 5 and 6 says, when the camp is to set out, Aaron and his sons shall go in and take down the veil of the screen and cover the ark of the testimony with it. Verse 6, then they shall put on it a covering of goatskin and spread on top of that a cloth of all blue, and shall put in its poles. In other words, that's when they were getting ready to travel and the ark was going to be carried. God didn't want anybody seeing it. It was to be covered not just by one layer, but two layers. Secondly, when the ark was being transported, when Israel was traveling, God commanded a very specific way to do it. This time, Exodus 25. Let's read verses 13 through 15. You shall make poles of acacia wood and overlay them with gold. And you shall put the poles into the rings on the side of the ark to carry the ark by them. The poles shall remain in the rings of the ark. They shall not be taken from it. That's how you transported the ark. That was God's command. And then when it was being carried, when it was being transported, that job was given to a very specific group of people, not just the Levites, the tribe that took care of worship in Israel, but there was a clan in the Levites known as the Kohathites, and it was their task. Let's go back to Numbers 4, and let's begin reading at the middle of verse 15. The sons of Kohath shall come to carry these, that includes the ark, but they must not touch the holy things, lest they die. These are the things of the tent of meeting that the sons of Kohath are to carry. And if you read that longer passage, you find that it's the ark that's included in the list that this particular group of Levites is assigned to carry on their shoulders. But years later, for whatever reason was going through his mind or not going through his mind, when it came to moving the ark to Jerusalem, David ignored what God had said. Rather than covering the ark, there were hundreds and maybe thousands of people who were looking at it out in the open. Rather than carrying it on poles, it was loaded up on a cart pulled by some oxen. And it wasn't the Kohathites who were carrying it. It was being carried by whoever was there. And most dangerous of all, the people were ignoring the very clear warning that God had given. Numbers 4:15, one more time. They must not touch the holy things lest they die. And in the context, that list of holy things included the ark. And that's exactly what happened. And let's read again how David responded. 2 Samuel 6, verse 8. And David was angry because the Lord had broken out against Uzzah. But I have to wonder if David's anger about what had happened was actually in part a deeper feeling of shame or guilt coming through, because as the king and as the leader, David should have taken the necessary precautions. He should have done things the right way. But because he had failed, now a man was dead. But even knowing all this and all the background and all the history, we haven't fully answered the question that a lot of people ask, which is this. When Uzzah reached out to steady the ark, it was not, I don't believe, and neither do you, it was not a premeditated act of rebellion. Most people agree he was simply trying to do the right thing. He didn't want the ark to fall onto the ground. And so people wonder, why would God kill a man who was simply trying to do what he thought was the right thing? But in trying to do the right thing, Uzzah actually did something that was terribly wrong, because he made an assumption that a lot of people make, which is that he understood what was right and what was wrong. In a split second of time, he made a decision that it would be worse for the ark to touch the ground than to touch him. And so he acted. And in doing so, he simply did what probably the majority of individuals in his position would have done themselves. That was the problem. Time and time again in the Old Testament, God had made it very, very clear that the ark was holy and it was not to be touched by human beings. But so often we as human beings take what God has said and we replace it with what makes sense to us. Time and time again, we have redefined what's right and what's wrong until what's wrong has become what's right, and what's right has become what's wrong, not only in our thinking, but also in the way we behave. Now, back under the days of Moses' leadership, this would never have happened. The Israelites would never have carried the ark on a cart drawn by oxen. And if something had happened to the ark in the process of it being carried, no one would have dared to reach out and touch it. But by David's day, people had forgotten. It had been a very long time. And this was God's reminder to David and to the people of Israel that his laws and his expectations had never changed. This is why we want to be so careful about accepting the definitions of morality, the definitions of right and wrong that the world promotes as true. Because what's considered to be right and moral today, tomorrow will be rejected and replaced by something new. That's the way the world works. So what do we as Christians do? If the definition of right and wrong is always changing, how do we respond? Well, I would say rather than spending a lot of time chasing after the changing definitions of morality in this world, let's hear what Jesus said in response to a religious expert who came to him one time and asked him a question about what was the most important commandment of God. You find the story in Matthew 22. And I want to read verses 37 through 39. These are the words of Jesus. And he said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself." The point being, if I genuinely love God, then I'm going to go out of my way to show love to you. And that means that I don't have to worry about society's changing morals and changing standards, because I'm following after a higher standard. And so no matter how right or how wrong the latest issue of the day might seem to the people of the world around us, a wise believer always chooses to follow God's higher standards, because we know that's the way to live, and that's the way to be blessed by God.